The plane hummed softly, a steady reminder of its journey through the endless blue above the clouds. Henry Ellis sat quietly in his seat, a paperback novel resting in his lap. His hands, weathered by decades of work, lightly traced the edge of the page he was about to turn. He wasn't reading, not really. His eyes flicked occasionally to the words. But his mind wandered, a habit he'd picked up in retirement. Flying wasn't something he did often. But today's trip was special. A family reunion awaited him on the other side of the country, and he could already picture the joy on his granddaughter's face when she saw him at the airport gate. Across the aisle, Vanessa Cole's sharp voice cut through the relative quiet. She was the kind of woman who wore her ambition like armor. Her navy suit was tailored perfectly, her carry-on a sleek, expensive model that practically announced her success. She had boarded the plane with a purpose, barely glancing at her fellow passengers as she navigated to her seat. Time was money, after all, and she had a conference to prepare for. But now, something was wrong. "My laptop," Vanessa said, her tone clipped, her words deliberate. "It's gone." She stood, her movements quick and exact, scanning the overhead compartment as though the device might materialize if she looked hard enough. Henry glanced up briefly, his brow furrowing, then returned to his book. Trouble had a way of finding people who didn't mind their own business. He thought, best to stay out of it. A flight attendant appeared, her professional smile faltering as she caught Vanessa's expression. "Is there something I can assist with?" "Ma'am?" "Yes," Vanessa said, gesturing toward the overhead bin. "My laptop was in there. Now it's not." The attendant nodded, her gaze following Vanessa's gesture. "Perhaps it shifted during takeoff." "Let me." "It didn't just shift," Vanessa interrupted, her voice rising. "It's gone. Someone took it." Her eyes darted around the cabin, landing squarely on Henry. He was the closest to the compartment. "After all, she said sharply. "You were sitting right there. Did you see anything?" Henry looked up slowly, his dark eyes calm, unreadable. "I didn't touch your laptop," he said, his voice steady. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just the simple truth. But Vanessa wasn't convinced. "How can you be so sure? You were sitting right here. You could have taken it before we boarded." The flight attendant hesitated, her gaze flicking between Vanessa and Henry. "Ma'am, let's not jump to conclusions. I'm sure we'll find your laptop." "It's not about jumping to conclusions," Vanessa snapped. "I know what I saw or didn't see. He's the only one who could have taken it." Henry closed his book, carefully marking his place before setting it on the tray table. "I didn't take your laptop," he repeated. His voice remained calm, but there was a weight to it now, a quiet authority that cut through the air. The flight attendant looked uneasy, but she didn't challenge Vanessa's accusation. Instead, she turned to Henry, her tone shifting. "Sir, do you mind if we check your belongings? Just to clear this up?" Henry hesitated, a flicker of something, pain? Resignation? Crossing his face. He nodded once, slowly, and began to open the small duffel bag at his feet. From a few rows back, a young voice broke the tension. "Wait," Jamie Parker said, their tone uncertain but determined. The high school student leaned into the aisle, holding up their phone. "I think I recorded something earlier. Maybe it'll help." All eyes turned toward Jamie, and for the first time, the cabin fell silent. Henry exhaled softly, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. For now, he was just grateful someone else was willing to look a little closer. Jamie Parker had always been an observer. At 16, the world often felt like a puzzle with too many pieces. But they were content to sit on the sidelines and watch it all unfold. This flight was no different. From their window seat near the back of the plane, Jamie had spent the first hour gazing at the clouds, the vast expanse of sky offering a quiet escape from the noise of everyday life. When the commotion began, Jamie had turned their attention to the scene in the middle of the cabin. At first, it seemed like a misunderstanding, a missing laptop, a concerned passenger. But the longer Jamie watched, the more uncomfortable they became. The way the businesswoman's voice sharpened when she addressed the elderly man. The way the flight attendant's professional demeanor shifted, almost imperceptibly, when she turned to him. It was subtle, But Jamie noticed. They always noticed. Henry Ellis, the man at the center of it all, seemed unfazed. His calm response, his steady hands as he opened his bag, it all spoke of someone who had been here before. Not on a plane, perhaps, but in this position, accused, scrutinized, forced to prove his innocence. Jamie didn't know his story, but they could see it in the way he held himself. There was a quiet dignity there, but also a weariness. Jamie shifted in their seat, their phone resting on their lap. They had started recording earlier, out of habit more than anything else. It wasn't the first time they'd witnessed something like this. A teacher assuming the worst about a black student. A security guard following a customer who didn't look like they belonged. Small moments that others brushed aside. But Jamie carried with them. Their parents often told them they were too sensitive. You can't fight every battle. Their mom would say with a sigh. Sometimes, you just have to let things go. Jamie wondered if this was one of those times. No one else seemed to be stepping in. The other passengers were watching. Sure, but no one spoke. The flight attendant looked uneasy but hadn't challenged the woman's accusations. Even Henry seemed resigned to the situation, quietly complying as he unzipped his bag. But Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that staying silent wasn't the right choice this time. They didn't know Henry, but they knew what it felt like to be judged unfairly. To have someone assume the worst about you because of something as superficial as the color of your skin or the way you dressed. The phone in their hand felt heavier now, its screen glowing faintly as Jamie reviewed the video they had recorded. The footage wasn't dramatic, just a few seconds of Vanessa placing her laptop in the overhead bin. Her back turned to Henry as she fussed with her bag. But it was enough. Enough to prove that Henry hadn't touched the laptop. Enough to stop this from spiraling further. Jamie took a deep breath, their fingers tightening around the phone. They could feel the weight of the moment. The decision they were about to make. Speaking up wouldn't be easy. It never was. But Jamie knew they couldn't just sit back and watch. Wait, they said, their voice breaking the tense silence that had settled over the cabin. Heads turned, curious eyes landing on the teenager who had barely been noticed until now. Jamie hesitated, their heart pounding, but when they spoke again, their voice was steady. I think I recorded something earlier. Maybe it can help. The flight attendant looked at them, surprised, and then back at Vanessa, whose expression had shifted from anger to uncertainty. Jamie stood, holding out the phone. Here, they said quietly. You can see for yourself. As the flight attendant reached for the phone, Jamie glanced at Henry. His eyes met theirs, and for a moment, they thought they saw a flicker of something, gratitude, perhaps, or relief. Jamie wasn't sure, but they knew one thing. Staying silent wasn't an option anymore. The cabin was a strange mix of silence and sound. The steady hum of the engines provided a backdrop to the quiet murmurs of passengers exchanging uneasy glances. The atmosphere, once casual and indifferent, had shifted into something taut and heavy. Henry Ellis sat back in his seat, his hands resting lightly on his thighs. His expression was unreadable, but the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed the discomfort he carried. Vanessa Cole stood a few feet away, her posture rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wasn't speaking now, but the set of her mouth and the darting of her eyes told the story clearly enough. She still believed what she had claimed. The presence of doubt, introduced by the teenager and their phone, seemed to irritate her more than the loss of the laptop itself. The flight attendant, Amelia Ford, held Jamie's phone in her hands. Her brows were furrowed in concentration as she replayed the brief footage. The other passengers craned their necks, hoping for a glimpse, but Amelia kept the screen angled away from prying eyes. When she finished watching, she hesitated, glancing at Vanessa before turning to Henry. It seems, Amelia began, her voice professional but edged with uncertainty. The video shows you placing your laptop in the compartment. Ms. Cole, there's no indication Mr. Ellis touched it. Vanessa's lips parted as though she was about to argue. But no words came out. Her face flushed, the faint pink creeping up her neck and settling on her cheeks. That doesn't mean it wasn't taken later, she said finally, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Someone could have. Ma'am, Amelia interrupted gently but firmly. Perhaps we should double-check the other compartments. It's possible your laptop was moved accidentally. Vanessa hesitated, her hands clenching and unclenching as if she were holding back a retort. Instead, she nodded sharply and stepped aside, allowing Amelia to begin the search. The attendant opened each overhead bin in the immediate vicinity, her movements deliberate, but the tension in the air didn't ease. The passengers watched with mixed expressions, some with curiosity, others with impatience, a few with quiet indignation. It wasn't hard to see the undercurrent running through the cabin. The unspoken assumption, the unchallenged bias, had been laid bare. Most people wouldn't admit it aloud. But the accusatory glance that many had directed at Henry lingered in the air like a shadow. Henry sat silently, his gaze fixed out the window. The clouds below stretched endlessly, soft and unbroken, a stark contrast to the turbulence within the cabin. He wasn't surprised by how things had unfolded. In fact, he'd expected it the moment the accusation had been made. It wasn't the first time he'd been viewed with suspicion. He doubted it would be the last. Jamie, still standing nearby, shifted awkwardly. Their courage in speaking up had drawn attention. But it wasn't the kind they were used to. They caught Henry's eye again and offered a tentative smile. But he simply nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Jamie wasn't sure if it was gratitude or just exhaustion. As Amelia moved to the next bin, there was a faint thud, followed by a soft exclamation. "Here it is," she announced, pulling out a sleek laptop that matched Vanessa's earlier description. She turned to Vanessa, her voice carefully neutral. "It seems it was moved during boarding. Likely by another passenger making room for their luggage." Vanessa stared at the laptop as if it were an unwelcome surprise. She reached for it, her expression a mix of relief and something else, embarrassment. Perhaps, though she masked it quickly. I see," she said, her voice lower now, almost subdued. "Thank you." Amelia handed her the laptop, then turned back to Henry. "Mr. Ellis," she said quietly, her tone apologetic. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience. I should have handled this differently." Henry looked up at her, his expression softening just a fraction. "No harm done," he said, though the words carried a weight that wasn't entirely convincing. Vanessa opened her mouth as though to say something, then closed it again. She returned to her seat without meeting Henry's eyes. The tension in the cabin began to dissipate, though it didn't vanish entirely. The incident left a residue, an uncomfortable awareness that settled over everyone. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. But the energy had shifted. Jamie sat back in their seat, their hands still gripping their phone. They glanced at Henry one last time before turning toward the window. The plane cruised on, steady and unrelenting, as if the skies above were indifferent to the turbulence below. The cabin had settled into a tenuous quiet, like the stillness after a storm. The hum of the engines, constant and indifferent, seemed louder now. Henry Ellis remained in his seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His composure hadn't faltered during the ordeal. But there was something in the way he sat, a heaviness, as if years of similar experiences had carved out a permanent space for quiet resignation. Across the aisle, Vanessa Cole stared at her laptop, now safely retrieved and resting on the tray table in front of her. She didn't open it. Instead, her hands fidgeted with the clasp of her watch, her gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance. She hadn't looked at Henry since Amelia had apologized. She hadn't looked at anyone. Jamie Parker, still clutching their phone, felt the weight of the silence. They had done the right thing, hadn't they? The video they'd recorded had cleared Henry of any suspicion. But the atmosphere in the cabin didn't feel celebratory. If anything, it felt heavier, more complicated. Jamie glanced at Henry again, searching his expression for some kind of reassurance. But his gaze remained fixed on the clouds outside. The flight attendant, Amelia, returned to Henry's row. She paused, her hands clasped in front of her, and spoke softly, so only he and a few nearby passengers could hear. "Mr. Ellis, I'd like to apologize again," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a note of unease, as though she wasn't sure her words would be enough. "I shouldn't have assumed anything without evidence. That wasn't fair to you." Henry turned to her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed he might let the silence stretch. But then he nodded. "I appreciate you saying that. He replied evenly. His voice carried the same quiet strength as before. Unshaken but deliberate. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened to me. And I doubt it'll be the last. Amelia flinched. Just slightly. The truth in his words was undeniable. And the weight of them seemed to land squarely on her shoulders. I'll do better, she said, almost to herself. Then, after a moment, she added, thank you for your patience. Henry didn't respond, and Amelia moved on, walking down the aisle to check on other passengers. Jamie watched her go, then turned back to Henry. Mr. Ellis, they said hesitantly, their voice quiet but clear. He glanced at them, his dark eyes softening slightly. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what happened, and for not speaking up sooner. Henry studied them for a moment before offering a faint smile. You spoke up when it mattered. He said, that's what counts. Jamie nodded, relief mingling with the lingering discomfort of the situation. They wanted to say more. To ask him how he could remain so calm. So composed. But the words didn't come. Instead, they looked back out the window. The clouds below stretching endlessly toward the horizon. As the plane cruised on, the cabin began to buzz with quiet conversation. Passengers who had watched the scene unfold now spoke in low voices. Their tones uncertain, reflective. A man in the next row leaned toward his wife. His words just audible over the hum of the engines. Did you see how calm he was? I don't know if I could have handled that. His wife nodded, her expression pensive. Makes you think, doesn't it, about how quick we are to judge. Nearby, an older woman adjusted her reading glasses and glanced at Vanessa. She should have apologized, she murmured to the man beside her. He nodded in agreement but didn't look up from his newspaper. Vanessa, for her part, remained silent. Her laptop sat untouched, the screen dark. She stared at it for a long time. Her jaw tight, her thoughts inscrutable. Whatever she was feeling, shame, frustration, anger, it stayed locked behind her carefully composed expression. Henry turned back to his window, the clouds reflecting faintly in his glasses. He didn't dwell on what had happened. He couldn't afford to. Life had taught him to let go of the small battles, to save his energy for the ones that truly mattered. But even as he sat there, calm and composed, he couldn't ignore the ache in his chest, the quiet, persistent weight of knowing that, no matter how much grace he showed, he would always be judged by some before he was even allowed to speak. The truth had come to light. Yes, but the shadows it revealed still lingered, stretching across the faces of everyone in the cabin. And as the plane soared on, steady and unrelenting, Henry could only hope that the next time, because there would always be a next time, things might turn out differently. The flight continued its steady course. But the cabin remained restless. Conversations bubbled and fizzled, passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The incident was over, but its echoes lingered. Every glance, every whisper carried the weight of unspoken questions and unease. Henry Ellis leaned back, his hands resting on the armrests as though bracing himself against the tide of emotions swirling around him. He didn't meet anyone's eyes, but he could feel their gazes. Some were sympathetic, others curious, and a few carried something else, a discomfort that came from being confronted with their own assumptions. Vanessa Cole, sitting across the aisle, was silent. Her laptop remained closed, her fingers tapping lightly against the tray table as though trying to dispel the tension running through her. Finally, she shifted in her seat and turned toward Henry. Mr. Ellis, she began, her voice softer than it had been before. There was no sharpness now. No accusation, only hesitation. I want to apologize. For what happened earlier. Henry looked at her, his expression steady but unreadable. He waited, giving her space to continue. Vanessa hesitated, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. I didn't mean to accuse you like that. I was worried about my laptop. And she stopped herself, as though realizing how hollow her words sounded. I'm sorry, she said again, this time quieter. Henry held her gaze for a long moment before nodding. Apology accepted, he said simply. His tone was calm, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that Vanessa couldn't ignore. She nodded, her shoulders dropping slightly, but her eyes didn't meet his again. Instead, she turned back to her seat. her face flushed with something that might have been shame. Nearby, a passenger, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, cleared his throat. He leaned into the aisle, his gaze shifting between Henry and Vanessa. "If you don't mind me saying," he began cautiously, "this kind of thing happens far too often." Henry looked at him, his expression unreadable, but he didn't interrupt. The man shifted in his seat, as though searching for the right words. "I mean, I've seen it before. People jumping to conclusions because of how someone looks. It's not right." From the row behind him, an older woman spoke up. "It's more than not right," she said, her tone firm. "It's harmful to all of us." Vanessa stiffened in her seat, but she didn't respond. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder as more passengers began to weigh in. "It's easy to make assumptions," another voice said. "We all do it, but that doesn't excuse it." "Exactly," someone else added. "It's about learning to do better." Henry listened quietly, his expression calm but distant. He had heard conversations like this before, moments of reflection that often faded as quickly as they appeared. Still, there was something different about hearing it here, in this space, among people who might not have spoken up otherwise. Jamie Parker, sitting a few rows away, leaned forward in their seat. "It's not just about learning to do better," they said, their voice clear but hesitant. "It's about speaking up when you see something wrong. If I hadn't said anything, who knows how this would have ended?" The cabin fell quiet at that, the weight of Jamie's words settling over everyone. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Henry turned to the teenager, a faint smile breaking through his calm exterior. "You're right," he said. "It takes courage to speak up. More courage than most people realize." Jamie flushed, looking down at their hands. But they smiled back. The flight attendant, Amelia, returned to Henry's row, her expression somber but determined. "Mr. Ellis," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I want to thank you for your patience. And I want to apologize again. Not just for myself, but for the way you were treated." Henry regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. Amelia turned to address the cabin, her voice carrying over the soft hum of the engines. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all for your understanding during this situation. And I hope we can all take a moment to reflect on what's happened here today." Her words hung in the air, the cabin falling silent once more. Henry turned back to the window, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of clouds. The confrontation was over, but the questions it raised remained. Questions about judgment, about assumptions, about the quiet, pervasive presence of prejudice. As the plane continued its journey, the passengers sat with their thoughts, the weight of the moment pressing against them like the steady pressure of the altitude. And Henry, sitting quietly in his seat, carried the same hope he always did, that perhaps this time, the lesson would linger. The cabin had grown quieter now, the earlier tension settling into a contemplative hush. Passengers turned back to their books, their screens, or the view outside the small oval windows. But the air was still thick with the weight of what had unfolded. The plane hummed steadily, a quiet backdrop to the unspoken questions and reflections that lingered in the minds of those on board. Henry Ellis sat in his seat, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His composure hadn't wavered throughout the ordeal. But now, with the immediate conflict behind him, a weariness settled into his features. It wasn't the kind of tiredness that came from lack of sleep, but something deeper, more ingrained. A lifetime of moments like these left a mark, invisible to most but impossible to forget. From across the aisle, Jamie Parker leaned forward slightly, their phone now resting forgotten on the tray table. They hesitated before speaking, their voice quiet but clear. "Mr. Ellis?" Henry turned to them, his expression softening at the sight of the teenager's earnest face. "Yes," he replied, his tone as calm as ever. Jamie faltered, unsure how to put their thoughts into words. "I wanted to say I admire how you handled everything. I don't think I could have stayed so calm." Henry regarded them for a moment, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It comes with practice," he said, his voice carrying a wry edge. "Not the kind of practice anyone wants, mind you, but practice all the same." Jamie's brow furrowed, their expression pensive. That's not fair, they said after a moment. You shouldn't have to deal with things like this. No one should. Henry nodded slowly. You're right, he said. It's not fair, but fairness isn't something life guarantees us. Is it? All we can do is decide how to respond when it's missing. Jamie didn't reply immediately, their gaze dropping to their hands. After a moment, they looked back up. I'm glad I spoke up, they said, but I should have done it sooner. Henry reached across the aisle, resting a hand briefly on Jamie's arm. You spoke up when it mattered, he said. That's more than most people do. Nearby, a middle-aged woman shifted in her seat, her eyes lingering on the exchange. She hesitated, then leaned forward. Excuse me, she said softly, addressing Henry. I just wanted to say, I think you handled yourself with a lot of grace back there. More than most of us would have. Henry met her gaze, his expression kind but reserved. Thank you, he said simply. The woman smiled faintly but didn't press further. Sitting back in her seat. Across the aisle, Vanessa Cole remained silent. She hadn't spoken since her brief apology. And now her focus seemed fixed on the clouds outside her window. Her hands were still, resting on the closed laptop in her lap. But there was a tension in her shoulders. A rigidity that suggested she hadn't quite found peace with what had happened. A few seats away, another passenger, a man with silver hair and a quiet, thoughtful demeanor, cleared his throat. It's easy to let our assumptions guide us, he said, addressing no one in particular but speaking loud enough to be heard. We see what we expect to see, not what's actually there. I think that's what happened today. Heads turned toward him, some nodding in quiet agreement. His wife, seated beside him, added, and it's not just one person's mistake. We've all been guilty of it at some point. The important thing is to learn from it. Isn't it? Henry looked at the couple, his expression thoughtful. Learning is a start, he said after a moment. But change takes more than just learning. It takes effort. And it takes courage. The older man nodded, his expression serious. You're right, he said. And maybe moments like this, uncomfortable as they are, can push us to be better. Jamie, emboldened by the exchange, chimed in. It's not just about seeing what's wrong, they said. It's about doing something about it. Even if it's hard. Especially if it's hard. Henry turned to them, his eyes warm. You've got a good head on your shoulders, he said. Hold on to that. The cabin fell quiet again. But the silence was different this time. It wasn't the tense, uncertain quiet that had followed the accusation. It was reflective, almost hopeful, as though the seeds of understanding had been planted, waiting to take root. As the plane cruised on, Henry leaned back in his seat, his gaze returning to the clouds outside. The conversation had been a small step, a moment of connection in a world that often felt divided. He didn't know if it would lead to lasting change. But for now, it was enough. As the flight began its gradual descent, the golden hues of the setting sun spilled through the cabin windows, casting long, soft shadows over the passengers. The earlier unease had dissipated somewhat, but its echoes lingered in the quiet exchanges between those who had witnessed the events unfold. It was as if the cabin itself held its breath, reflecting the introspection of those on board. Henry Ellis, ever composed, adjusted his seatbelt and glanced briefly out the window. He didn't need the reflection to remind him of the weight of the day. He felt it in the subtle ache in his chest, the familiar heaviness that came with being seen, not for who he was, but for what others assumed. Yet his face betrayed none of this. His calm was an armor honed over decades. Across the aisle, Vanessa Cole sat stiffly, her posture immaculate but her expression clouded. The laptop she had so fiercely defended earlier now rested unopened in her lap. Her fingers traced its edges absently, as though she were deliberating over what to do. Finally, she shifted, turning toward Henry. Mr. Ellis, she began, her voice quieter than before. For the first time, it lacked the sharpness it had carried earlier. I owe you another apology. Henry turned to her, his gaze steady and patient. He said nothing, allowing her the space to continue. Vanessa hesitated, her hands tightening around the laptop. I let my fear, my assumptions get the better of me, she said, and I realize now that it wasn't fair. To you, to anyone. Her words hung in the air. And for a moment, Henry didn't respond. Then, he nodded slowly, his voice calm and measured. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "It's not always easy to recognize when we've been wrong." Vanessa looked down, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It's not," she admitted. "But I'm trying. I really am." Henry studied her for a moment longer before offering a faint smile. "Trying is a good place to start." Their exchange, though brief, seemed to ripple through the cabin. Other passengers glanced toward them, their expressions thoughtful. Some nodded subtly, as though affirming Vanessa's words. Others simply sat quietly, their gazes fixed on their own reflections in the dim windows. Amelia, the flight attendant, approached then, her professional demeanor tempered by a hint of vulnerability. "Mr. Ellis," she said softly, her tone carrying a sincerity that hadn't been present earlier. "I want to thank you for your patience today. And for your grace. It's made me think about how I approach my work. About how I approach people." Henry looked up at her, his expression kind but reserved. "It's a lesson worth learning," he said. "For all of us." Amelia nodded, her eyes glistening slightly. She turned to address the cabin, her voice carrying over the gentle hum of the engines. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her words steady but thoughtful. "As we prepare for landing, I want to thank you for your patience and understanding today. It's moments like these that remind us all of the importance of listening, of looking closer, and of treating each other with respect." A few passengers murmured in agreement. Others clapped softly, though the applause felt more like a gesture of solidarity than celebration. As Amelia returned to her duties, a passenger across the aisle, an elderly man with kind eyes and a deep, rumbling voice, leaned forward. "Mr. Ellis," he said, his tone warm but serious. "I just want to say you handled this with more dignity than most of us could muster. You've given me a lot to think about." Henry inclined his head slightly. A quiet acknowledgement. "I appreciate that," he said. The man smiled, leaning back in his seat. "The world needs more people like you," he added. Henry didn't respond, but his faint smile lingered as he turned back to the window. Outside, the clouds gave way to the outlines of the city below, the grid of lights flickering into view as the plane descended. Jamie, who had been quiet for much of the flight since their earlier intervention, leaned toward Henry. "You've really made an impression on people," they said, their voice filled with a mix of admiration and wonder. Henry glanced at them, his eyes warm but reflective. "Sometimes, it's not about what we say," he replied. "It's about how we carry ourselves, even when the world tries to make it difficult." Jamie nodded slowly, their expression thoughtful. "I think I'll remember that," they said. As the plane touched down, the cabin filled with the familiar sounds of landing seat belts clicking, overhead bins opening, passengers preparing to disembark. But the usual rush felt subdued, as though the weight of the day had left everyone moving a little slower, thinking a little deeper. Henry gathered his belongings methodically, his movements unhurried. As he stood, several passengers turned to him, offering small nods, quiet smiles, or murmured words of gratitude and respect. He acknowledged each gesture with the same quiet dignity he had carried throughout the flight. Vanessa, still seated, watched him for a moment before speaking again. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice almost a whisper. Henry met her gaze, his expression gentle but firm. "Take care of yourself," he said. And with that, he stepped into the aisle, his presence a quiet reminder of the strength and grace it takes to rise above the judgments of others. The plane rolled to a smooth stop at the gate, the hum of the engines fading into silence. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, offering polite words of thanks and a cheerful reminder to gather personal belongings. But the usual rush to disembark was slower, more measured. The passengers seemed caught in a collective pause, as if unsure how to leave behind the moments that had bound them together during the flight. Henry Ellis waited patiently in his seat, his duffel bag resting at his feet. He had no reason to rush. His family would be waiting for him, no matter how long it took to reach the terminal. As passengers filed past, some nodded in his direction, offering small smiles or murmured words of acknowledgement. A few extended hands, gestures of respect and gratitude that Henry met with quiet grace. Jamie Parker lingered in the aisle. Their phone tucked away. Their face thoughtful. "Mr. Ellis," they said softly, stepping closer. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. I learned a lot today." Henry looked at them, his expression kind but serious. "It's not always easy to stand up for what's right," he said. "But you did. That matters." Jamie smiled, a small but genuine gesture, and nodded. "Take care," they said before moving toward the exit. Vanessa Cole was among the last to leave. She hesitated at Henry's row, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. For a moment, it seemed she might continue walking. But then she stopped and turned to face him. "I've got a lot to think about," she admitted, her voice quiet. I hope I can do better." Henry regarded her calmly, his gaze steady but not unkind. "The first step is realizing there's room to grow," he said. "The rest is up to you." Vanessa nodded, her expression solemn. She started to speak again but stopped herself, offering a faint smile instead before walking away. The aisle slowly emptied, the once bustling cabin now quiet save for a few attendants gathering discarded items. Henry stood, his movements deliberate, and retrieved his bag from under the seat. As he made his way toward the exit, Amelia Ford, the flight attendant, stood by the door. Her posture was poised, but her expression carried a vulnerability she had kept hidden earlier. "Mr. Ellis," she said as he approached, her voice softer now, "thank you for your patience today. And for your example." Henry paused, his gaze meeting hers. "Patience isn't always a choice," he said. "Sometimes it's the only way forward." Amelia nodded, her eyes glistening slightly. "Even so, I'll carry this with me. I won't forget." Henry offered her a faint smile, then stepped through the door and onto the jet bridge. The airport was bustling, filled with the familiar chaos of arrivals and departures. Henry walked at a steady pace, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on a cluster of familiar faces. His granddaughter waved eagerly, her smile wide and bright, and Henry felt a warmth spread through him that eased the weariness of the day. As he embraced his family, their laughter and joy washing over him, Henry felt a quiet sense of renewal. The world outside wasn't perfect, far from it, but here, in this moment, there was love, there was connection, and there was hope. Blank. Blank. On the plane, now empty and quiet, Amelia gathered her things. She paused by her station, her thoughts lingering on the events of the flight. She knew it was just one moment, one instance of a story far too common, but it had left its mark. As she walked down the jet bridge, she made a quiet vow to herself, to listen more, to judge less, to do better. In another corner of the airport, Vanessa sat at a cafe, her laptop untouched. She sipped her coffee, her mind far from the emails and presentations awaiting her. She replayed Henry's calm words in her head, the quiet dignity he had shown, and wondered how many times she had overlooked people like him, people who deserved her respect long before she realized her mistake. She didn't have answers yet, but she was beginning to ask the right questions. And Jamie, waiting for their connecting flight, typed a message to their friends, recounting the day's events. They hoped it would inspire others to speak up, to pay attention, to do something when it mattered. They didn't know if it would, but they felt a small sense of purpose, a belief that even small actions could ripple outward. Blank. As Henry walked toward the baggage claim with his family, the voices of his grandchildren rising in laughter, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The day had been long, challenging in ways he knew all too well, but it had also been a day of small victories, of seeds planted in the minds of strangers, of connections forged in unexpected places. The world hadn't changed, not entirely, not yet, but as he stepped into the embrace of his loved ones, Henry carried with him the quiet hope that change was always possible. One moment, one person, one story at a time.